The UN command was convinced the war was won, but attitudes in Washington were beginning to change. US Secretary of Defense George Marshall, who knew the Chinese communist leaders, suggested that in a war with limited objectives, old ideas of winning and losing were perhaps no longer relevant. But he felt the American public would not understand.
But I said, General Marshall, a great deal of water has gone under the dam since World War II. I said, would you say I was naive if I said the American people had learned their lesson? And he looked at me with those cold blue eyes and he said, no, Pace, I wouldn't say you were naive. I'd say you were incredibly naive.
The offensive, having reached its first objective, Pyongyang, was now poised to continue north to the Yalu River. Meanwhile, Chinese troops were moving down the central mountain range. In an effort to trap North Korean army and party leaders in Pyongyang, an airborne operation was mounted. The UN command, however, had very poor intelligence, and the planners of the drop were unaware of the North Korean withdrawal. The airborne troops did discover some American soldiers who had been prisoners of the North Koreans since the summer battles further south. They had harrowing tales to tell their rescuers.
Well, the first bunch went outside the tunnel, and we heard a lot of firing. Of course, we didn't know what it was. We didn't know it was coming off at all. But my group was the second group, and when we took off, we went outside the tunnel there for a few feet and turned up a ravine there. And we went up there for about 10 feet, and they told us to sit down. Well, we sit down, and then they opened fire on us.
There were about 30 of you?
I didn't even know what was coming off there at first until I heard someone say, oh, my God. And then all I could do was just lay down and pray.
You had not been hit yet?
I hadn't been hit right then. And I just laid there, and I felt the first bullet. And then I thought I might be hit again, and I just had to lay there and wait.
Where were you hit?
Through the thighs, sir.
Were all those around you killed, as far as you know?
Well, I could hear them moaning, sir.
Just as in the summer, the government of Syngman Rhee had sought out its opponents and either imprisoned or killed many thousands of them, so now Kim Il-sung ruthlessly suppressed any opposition to his beleaguered regime.
Então, comandante falando assim.
In Kangay, trials of the officials who were accused of being anti-Kim Il-sung took place.
Aqui tem impatriota.
A general said, there are unfortunately among us government officials and military officers who are traitors. Traitors who insult the government of our leader, Kim Il-sung.
Antipatriota.
The crisis we face is caused by these traitors who are losing us the war. These treacherous comrades need to disappear. They should be killed.
The United Nations occupation of the North was harsh and at times brutal.
The Americans behaved in a way which I think is very typical. And I've seen them behaving the same way in Vietnam. First of all, you can't understand the Korean War if you don't use the word gooks. The gooks were the gooks. The gooks were not human beings. They were not even communists. They were gooks. And that, I think, is essential in the behavior of the Americans. They had to dehumanize the enemy, and they succeeded by calling them gooks and by putting them in a category of its own, which didn't belong to anything. Then they could forget the harm they might be doing.
MacArthur now divided the UN army. 10th Corps, the Marines, and 7th Division had been pulled out of the fighting in the West after the capture of Seoul. They were sent around Korea to the east coast port of Wonsan in an attempt to cut off the North Korean retreat. Marines were delayed offshore by mines. With the city having fallen days earlier to the South Koreans, General Arment's 10th Corps was given a new objective, an advance north towards the Chinese and Soviet borders. There were now two separate UN thrusts heading north.
I remember when I first arrived at 10th Corps headquarters, I said, how do I call my colleagues back in Seoul? And they said, there's no way, you have to go through Tokyo. And I said, how can that be? This is a war, this is a front. There was never physical contact made, as far as I know, between those two armies, between the 8th Army and the 10th Corps. I know that the day they were supposed to have a rendezvous somewhere in the middle, I think one side got there first and the other one never met them.
Directives forbade the use of non-Korean troops near the Chinese and Soviet borders. But US planes had crossed both frontiers. Having already bombed Chinese border towns, they strafed an airfield just inside the Soviet Union. On October the 24th, MacArthur ordered all units to proceed to the northern frontiers of Korea, the border with China and Russia. The South Koreans spearheaded the UN advance, determined to be first to the border, unaware that the Chinese were already waiting for them.
It was deep in the rear of the enemy line. I stayed with 3 men a little behind, waiting for the others to reconnoiter in front. We hid ourselves in the hills to avoid being discovered by enemy aircraft. We remained motionless the whole day from morning till nightfall.
Our leading battalion was hit by the Chinese. They got themselves into a defile without proper security, and they were opened up from all 4 sides, and that battalion was decimated, followed by the battalion in the rear, which then turned tail, because all of a sudden everybody knew we were fighting Chinese, and that scared everybody.
Surprise is no word for it. I mean, we were told that we were just going up to set up a position and hold it open so that the rocks could withdraw down through us. We had no idea that anybody else was coming into the war.
MacArthur had been so sure of victory that units were ordered to turn in ammunition and prepare to return to Japan. There had even been rumors of a victory parade through Tokyo. Some UN soldiers now found themselves joining a very different kind of parade. All along the front, the 8th Army was under attack by Chinese and North Korean units that had infiltrated behind UN lines. For 14 days, the attacks continued. The 8th Army was pushed back. Suddenly, on November the 6th, the attacks ended. The Chinese were marching away from the battlefield and back into the mountains. They had followed Mao's strategy and given the enemy a bloody nose. The key element was surprise. A nervous UN army clung to its superior technology. They knew they had been fighting the regular Chinese army as well as the North Koreans. Far East Command in Tokyo claimed it was unconvinced.
They would not immediately recognize the very real evidence that we had across the front that the Chinese were already into the war. And we were getting identifications. We knew who these Chinese were. We knew what army they belonged to, what division they belonged to. And it was hard for us to accept the fact that Tokyo did not recognize this.
MacArthur and his staff had fatally miscalculated the size and nature of the Chinese force they were facing and the strength of the remaining North Korean army. In his reports to the UN, MacArthur spoke only in general terms about the Chinese units in Korea. Against Far East Command's estimates of 30,000 Chinese, by the middle of November there were in fact almost 200,000 south of the Yanu. Finally, on November the 5th, MacArthur reacted to the